Worked with students for about 31 years. Scary. That's like, I started thinking about the amount of pizza I've eaten. Oh, gosh, it's so gross. How much cheese and pepperoni? That's just awful. And in those 31 years, I've made some amazing relationships. Students who have trusted me with their kind of the growth, their spiritual growth, and being part of their relationships and just be friends. And I've loved that. I've loved sharing that. And there are kids that walk into anybody's student ministry, any group, and you just instantly fall in love with them. They've got a smile that says, "I'm so glad you're here." And they're warm, and they just run up and give you hugs, and they're awesome, awesome kids. They make it easy to do your job. And then there's Jimmy. You know the Jimmy. Every group has a Jimmy. Jimmy's that kid that won't sit still. Jimmy's that kid that always has the wrong question to ask at the wrong time. Jimmy is the kid that no one wants in their small group. Jimmy's kind of a jerk. Jimmy plays too rough, hits too hard, is too loud, often has forgotten deodorant, and occasionally passes gas in the middle of prayer. And laughs while he does it. Anybody here know a Jimmy? Come on, if you know a Jimmy. All right. Anybody here own up to being a Jimmy? Thank you, Mr. Brock. Jimmies are what we call in the student ministry world EGRs, extra grace required. Jimmies are loud, they're self-important, and they complain about everything. Here's the crazy thing. I really do know a Jimmy. And Jimmy was part of a group of mine back in Southern California. And Jimmy, after he left my group, graduated, I had no idea what was going to happen to him. He was not one of the kids that, connected with and bonded with. God got a hold of him. Jimmy's now a pastor somewhere, teaching, leading, and preaching. And just so you know, Jimmy's name has been changed to protect the Jimmys in the world that are out there. And he's a good pastor. And when I found that out, here's the odd thing. I didn't like it. I didn't like it. How can God use a Jimmy? Jimmy's a jerk. Jimmy's not fun. Jimmy wasn't super holy from the very beginning. God chose Jimmy. God's using him to preach and teach the word. I think a lot of us live in that place of, I don't like that. God, I don't like who you've chosen. I don't like how you're telling your story this way. I don't like the people that you're choosing to tell your story. I don't think we like it when God chooses to use people that we don't like. But as we read Scripture over and over and over again, God always chooses to use people that we don't like. When we do this thing about judging folks, we put ourselves in a position as if we are better than them, as if we are over them, as if we have the right to sit in judgment on them. We doubt people's sincerity because we know their past. We know their patterns of behavior. We think because we've had a relationship with God longer, we are somehow better or more worthy. The way I describe this is, we have been rescued by God. We've been pulled into the lifeboat that is Jesus Christ, and we've been in there for a little while. We've dried off, and we've seen someone else in the water, and we're telling Jesus, just keep rowing, don't pick him up, because we're already comfortable. When in reality, we were just in the water a minute ago. And today, as we look at Nebuchadnezzar's story, we find out that God will even redeem our oppressors. Robert De Niro has a movie called Taxi Driver. I do not recommend it for anybody that's under the age of 40. Because if you're over 40, you've probably already seen it. And he has this line where he's looking in the mirror and he's really intent. And he's like, are you talking to me? Are you talking to me? And he's having this interaction with himself, trying to figure out how tough he can be. Can he pull this off? And Daniel, in our story this morning, has to walk into the presence of the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, and tell him some of the hardest things a king could ever hear. Daniel chapter 4. Starts out with King Nebuchadnezzar. The first words are King Nebuchadnezzar. And that's different than the other 3 chapters because this chapter is written in King Nebuchadnezzar's own hand. Hear that. This is his story. He's writing the story, not Daniel. This is what he's writing to other folks. Tell me if you hear the transformation in his story. King Nebuchadnezzar, to the nations and peoples of every language who live in all the earth, may you prosper greatly. It is my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous signs and wonders that the Most High God has performed for me. Wait. This is King Nebuchadnezzar, the guy that in our other stories was Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Shadrach and Benny, who threw those guys in the fiery furnace. This is the guy who basically believed in many gods. What is he doing talking about the one true God? Something's happened. It's my pleasure to tell you about the miraculous and wondrous signs that the Most High God has performed for me. How great are his signs, how mighty are his wonders. His kingdom is an eternal kingdom. His dominion endures from generation to generation. Wait a second, this was a guy that was just trying to kill Daniel and his friends. Matter of fact, just a few years earlier, he had sent an army in, destroyed all of Jerusalem, plundered it, took its children, put them in his kingdom, trained them to be his slaves. Wait, King Nebuchadnezzar, what is going on? And here's what's happening. The king has had another dream. He has this dream of this great tree, this tree that the animals seek shelter in, and it's beautiful and it's strong and it's wonderful, but it's disturbing because an angel shows up and says, chop that tree down. And the tree gets chopped down, and all the animals that are under the tree and in the tree, they flee it because it's horrible and it's awful. They strap the trunk of the tree down so it can never grow again, and it's going to stay like that for 7 seasons or 7 years. It's horrible, and it terrifies the king. It's all here in Daniel 4. And so he asks his advisors to explain the dream to him, and they're like, we don't know. Because they're afraid if they tell him what it really is, what they think it is, they could get in trouble. Daniel's the only one that has the courage to tell the king what the dream means. And he says this to the king. He says, oh, if this was only for your enemies, King Nebuchadnezzar. But it's for you. You see, the tree represents you and how great your kingdom is, how amazing your kingdom is. You've done such great, great things. And all the work that you've done, everything that's been built around you is so good. But you need to repent. See, the second part of the story is God is going to bring you low. He's going to humble you. He's going to chop down that tree. He's going to send you out and to make you like a wild beast. Please, King, please turn from your ways. Repent. Humble yourself. And the king thanks Daniel for the interpretation. And Daniel walks out going, I survived that. I told him the hard thing. The king for a whole year lives just like he has been living. And one day he's on his rooftop and he surveys everything that he's built and he goes, wow, look at how great my kingdom is. I've done a great job. I am a great king. And boom, God touches him. It's like he loses his mind. He runs out and he loses control of who he is. He becomes like a wild beast, living out in the forest, eating grass, letting the rain and the dew gather upon him. 7 years. 7 years. And then he walks back in because God has opened his eyes and he is humble. He has repented. And he writes this story. He says this about our God, his God. His dominion is eternal. His kingdom endures for generation to generation. All the people of the earth are regarded as nothing. He does as he pleases with the powers of heaven and the people of earth. No one can hold back his hand to say to him, "What have you done?" Nebuchadnezzar is a Jimmy. He's an extra grace required person. God takes him and puts him in a relationship with Daniel, and from that moment on, his relationship with God and Daniel and the people is changed forever. It's a powerful, powerful story. I didn't even get my water, I just held it there. King Nebuchadnezzar's issue, though, is that he lets his pride get in the way. Pride. Sounds like a simple thing, right? Just he let his pride get in the way. He heard the good news, he heard what he was supposed to do, but he didn't do it because he didn't want to. C.S. Lewis says this about pride. Pride is the essential vice. The utmost evil is pride. Unchastity, anger, greed, drunkenness, and all that are mere flea bites in comparison to pride. It was through pride that the devil became the devil. Pride leads to other vices. It's completely an anti-God state of mind. It's I'm sitting on the throne and you're not. It's about me and not about allowing God to be God. Proverbs 6:16 and 17, James 4:6 says, "It is pride that leads men to believe that we can live without God." And we can't. Because remember that second of the 4 G's? We live in guilt. We are sinful people. And because we sin, that separates us from God. And because we are separated from God, we are dead. Do you hear that? With sin, we are dead. With pride, we are, say it. Oh, you got to say it like you mean it. With pride, we are, because you have to understand that part. You have to understand that part because we got to get to this next part. So let's first find out, are you prideful? 1, do you long for lots of attention? Think about it. Is that you? I really wish people were looking at me more, paying attention to me more. If people only listened to me, it would be good. Are you jealous of other people's success? Do you always have to win? Even at board games, people? Come on. Do you have a pattern of lying? You know it. I mean, this is, lying. Let's not talk about that. Because a lot of us do that. Do you acknowledge when you're wrong? Do you have a lot of conflicts with other people? Because conflicts usually arise out of not humility, but out of pride. Do you cut in line at the grocery store or on the freeway? Are you one of those people that drives the access road as far as you can to get in front of my van while I'm trying to fight traffic at 35? Are you that person? Do you get upset when people don't acknowledge you? Those are all symptoms of pride. And pride, not that there's bigger sins out there, but pride is an invasive sin. It gets right to the core of your very being. You remember the movie The Titanic? Leonardo DiCaprio, there's this line where it says, "Not even God can sink this ship." It's just so funny. Because he did. He just did a little iceberg. And it's a sad story, but it was a pretty movie. So if we're a prideful people, what are we supposed to do? How are we supposed to live? If God is going to take people that we don't like to be our leaders, how does he do that? He does it beautifully. There's a line in my favorite books in the Bible, in Ephesians chapter 2. Some of my students know this because we've been talking about this. It's 2 little words, but God. Say that with me. But God. Now, I want you to understand, this but God changes everything. We're not talking about God's butt. We're talking about when God butts in. Because before this, here's what it says. It says, "As he made you alive, you were dead through your trespasses and sins in which you once walked, following the course of this world, following the prince and power of the air. The Spirit is now at work in the sons of disobedience. Among these we once lived by the passions of the flesh, following the desires of our body and mind, and so we were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind. It starts out by saying, you were dead because of your sin. But God, and I love this interruption, but God, who is rich in mercy, out of his great love, which he has loved us, even when we were dead in our trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. And he raised him up and made us sit with him in heavenly places. But God, he takes us from death to life. He takes us from our sin and moves us into grace. He takes Nebuchadnezzar, who is an evil king, and moves him into the place of, he's a son of God, just like every one of us in this room. And we can't sit in judgment over people who stumble over their past, or people who are stumbling in their presence, or the stumbles that we're going to make in our future, because God has butted in on your behalf. We need to be a people who are asking God simply to remove the sin of pride in our hearts and in our lives. To replace pride and place humility. The kind of humility that encourages us to be honest with ourselves, with each other, with our church, and even with God. Because some days I want to yell at God, going, I don't understand what's going on. I don't understand what's happening in my church, in my life, in my family, in this world. But God still shows up, still provides grace, still gives mercy, love, joy, hope, peace, and kindness, and helps me get through. Jimmy was an EGR. Nebuchadnezzar was an EGR. You and I are extra grace required kids. And we need to do what Nebuchadnezzar did and what Jimmy did, and that's tell our story. Daniel is interrupted by Nebuchadnezzar, the king, telling his story. It's beautiful. It's just the coolest thing. The king who was torturing, doing all these bad things to people, says, wait, we're going to put this in the Bible. This guy that was a bad dude is now like full on for God. It's so awesome. So church, what are you going to do? Are you going to grumble? Are you going to worry? Are you going to still be struggling because you're a prisoner in a strange land, in a strange culture? Or are you going to simply trust God in the midst of all those things? Are you going to, and I hope that you will continue to tell the story of God's grace in your life, God's mercy in your life, God's redemption in your life. I know which story I'd rather listen to. And it's not a grumbling story. Would you guys pray with me? I'm looking for Shia LaBeouf so he doesn't show up right now. Holy and gracious God, we thank you that you love us just as we are. We thank you that you redeem us from who we were, and you're creating in us who we're going to be. God, we thank you for the story of Daniel and his desire to speak the truths that he lived out in conviction because he trusted you. God, may we be men and women, boys and girls of deep faith and of deep conviction, that we can trust you even when things seem like they're going crazy. That we can trust you even when it feels as if the world is celebrating, but they're not always celebrating you. God, let us let go of our prideful heart and have it replaced with a heart of humility. We pray this in your Son's holy name. I pray in the Son, your prayer.